My aim isn't to teach Yiquan. No one can do that. It's like saying someone's going to teach you nature or your nature. Only you can unfold that. And my aim also isn't something grandiose like giving people the blueprints or the keys. The blueprints are in nature. Like the great Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi says, the only true lineage is to the way. I'd say the infinite Tao or something like that, but Musashi specifically points out organised Taoism as just another deviation, just another vessel, just another disconnection from what is ultimately innate to you. What I want to do is just save people time, years, maybe even decades. That means giving people useful and usable information. Some of that is conceptual, some of it's technical, some of it's demonstrated, and some of it's critical of negative dharma that's kind of taken over very much in the Yiquan world and needs responding to. Yiquan itself is a very simple thing. I think most of the work that we have to do is in debunking the silly directions that we've taken in some cases. Now, while concepts can radically leapfrog years and years of wasted time, nevertheless, obviously, the core of any physical training paradigm is physical training. Anything that we can experience physically could be explained conceptually, and that's usually very useful. It's what we call coaching. But it doesn't quite work the other way around. No matter how much you talk about things in theory, physical things that you have to experience, whether that be something like whole body unified force or what it's like to be in a real fight. And that's absolutely not the same. It's not the same as talking about it. It's not the same as sparring. And it really isn't the same as being in a competition fight. So some things have to be experienced physically and emotionally in some cases before you really understand them. Or, not to be misleading, I should say more clearly that conceptual understanding and physical training, physical understanding are intertwined elements of the method of progression. So what I'm trying to say is that although I'm not an Yiquan teacher, I'm a researcher. If I want to be grand, I'm an explorer in that region where intent and physicality meet. Even when I actually teach, i.e. actually teach students, even though I'm actually quite traditional in some ways, nevertheless, my role isn't to impart something to someone else, it's to help them understand what they already know. As Wang Shenjai said, we already know everything we need to know about the quintessence principles of Wushu because they're principles of nature. And we're physical beings who are subject to those laws, the laws of nature. So when I demonstrate and show physical things, it's part of a process of imparting knowledge, imparting useful information. It's not part of a process of teaching people. So, case in point, I want to move on to talking about whole body unified force, and I want to talk about the progression from balanced whole body unified force into unbalanced whole body unified force. And already just using the concepts causes people to appoint certain expectations about what these things are. And whole body unified force itself has been subject to a kind of a rinsing on internet discussion forums in the Yiquan discussion space, so much so that it's been built up into something so enormous, so beyond human comprehension that, well, it's become unachievable. So the first thing we need to do is disappoint our expectations. Don't let our imaginations run wild. It's a simple thing, but it's difficult to explain until you start experiencing it. And when you do, then you realize that it's not just one thing. That's why we talk about cultivation, improving it over time. But you'll also understand that you could just do it anyway, or you could do a version of it, or most people could just do a version of it pretty much immediately just by following the visual cues of someone who can already express good standard whole body unified force. If they can express it to the point where it's visual and you can see it, then you can kind of do a version of that. The problem is, so what? There are lots of people who achieve outstanding whole body unified force, but they don't take it into the next level where it has to be integrated with fight training and practice. So they never really go on to that point where whole body unified force becomes practical, becomes usable, becomes demonstrable. Finding yourself in that situation is called the malady of the state of Zhao. That's a proverb that refers to the state of Zhao during the Warring States period in China. There was a point where the soldiers of Zhao were highly trained. They had fantastic uniforms, fantastic weapons. Their drills were breathtaking, but they hadn't been to war for so long, for so many decades, that it was unclear whether they actually could fight or not. And for us, that means that there's an aesthetic to whole body unified force, or at least one form of whole body unified force that we see in motion. And that aesthetic on its own, it's a key stage in the development of skill, but on its own, it's useless. It's got to be trained for something. And as Wang Xiangjia himself says, it doesn't have to be trained for martial arts. It can be trained, for example, for dancing. And Wang Xiangjia says that once when he was watching Chinese opera troupes perform, it occurred to him that they had something very close to what he was trying to get across in Yiquan teaching, but it just wasn't quite there because it hadn't been moulded within the context of the reality of fight training. So we have to be very wary of falling into that trap, whether it's ourselves or whether it's seeing other people who have good whole body unified force. What we need to see and what we need to think about is how that then integrates into fight training and practice. And what we need to avoid is becoming like the wonderful, beautiful soldiers of Zhao who looked absolutely amazing, but who everyone else surrounding them began to suspect would actually be quite an easy target in reality because they just didn't have the practical experience of fight training. In Yiquan, the way to avoid this isn't just to do more sparring or fight training and fight practice. I know that's presented as a panacea these days for every ailment within Chinese physical culture. In Yiquan, that's critically important to do fight training and practice, to do sparring and to be fight focused, because that's what keeps the training honest and that's the point of it at the end of the day. But there's also a progression that begins with re-understanding our physical or innate potential. And that progression begins with truly learning how to relax. Then it moves into understanding and experiencing physically balanced whole body unified force. And then moving on to understand and experience physically unbalanced whole body unified force. This is the progression that leads to the foundation of fight training and practice. This is the progression that restructures the way we use ourselves as physical beings. It's like training talent before we begin training practical skill. There are no fixed methods in Yiquan, and Wang Xiangjia himself says the worst fixed method of all is to have fixed methods. But there is a logic to this progression, and it's a logic that's been understood for a very long time. And I know everyone always wants to take the shortcut to the most useful thing, but as Yao Zongzun says, this is the shortcut. This is the way that saves time in the long run. And I'm saying it like this because the exercises that we need to move on to might feel a little bit like, well, certainly the first one that we're going to do is very much like dead standing. That is, there's no visualization, there's no micro movement, and there's no skewing of the posture whatsoever. The intention is just to create a completely balanced posture, which, as you can see in the video, isn't all that easy for me because I'm stood on very uneven ground. Nevertheless, we want to create an effect, if possible, if we can get this exercise right, we can create a specific kind of effect where if we close our eyes, we can start feeling like our body isn't there or parts of our body aren't there. Because that's a fairly common thing that people experience in standing. If you close your eyes, you start thinking, has my arm moved dramatically? Are my fingers touching? You can no longer feel certain parts of your body, not because they've gone numb, but because there's no oppositional force to define your actual existence within space and time. And that's quite an unusual feeling. And if you can get it in the majority of your body, it's a little bit like being in one of those isolation tanks. Although I've never been in one, I'm just imagining that it must be something like that. And we need to spend a bit of time working on experiencing balanced whole body unified force. This is going to save us hours, days and years of time in the long run, and we can move on fairly quickly into working with unbalanced whole body unified force. But it's important to follow the progression if you want to understand what I'm talking about. I'm integrating physical understanding with conceptual understanding throughout this series. And although this first exercise is very much like dead standing, which isn't always as negative as people make out, the next exercise we do, we'll start building in visualization and we'll start working with balanced whole body unified force in a little bit of a more sophisticated manner. But for now, for this exercise, we take it back to that first moment where we learn to stand as an infant, and that's what we do first, we just stand. I'll talk about all the details and I'll talk about the more in-depth theory in the next video. For now, just follow along with me, or if you don't want to do that, just be inspired by the wonderful location I'm in with a waterfall. You've got to do a video like that at some point with a waterfall in the background if you're doing Chinese martial arts. Everyone knows that. And I didn't time it, but now that I've seen the video footage, I can see that I just stand first with my arms by my side, relaxing. That's a basic posture that's very often used in Chen Tai Chi before silk reeling. And just relax, but bear in mind this idea that we want to achieve balance. So we don't want to lean either way. We want to completely relax in the same way. Balance our whole posture, side to side, front to back. And then I'll put a little bell sound or a gong sound. I'll have a look at what I've got on the computer when I change my posture. So I change into a posture that just minimally expresses bow. So I've talked about bow quite a lot in the beginner series, so we should all already understand that concept. The posture that I form isn't quite bare holding a stone. It's a little bit of a wider, bigger posture, so my hands aren't quite as high as that. It's just the minimal expression of bow. And from there, again, I just want to focus on A, relaxing, and B, holding the posture as still and completely balanced as possible. And you can hold that posture for as long as you want, or you can do it on your own, or you can do it with me with the video. I think I do it for about half an hour, something like that. And then when we've done that, we'll be in a better position to understand some of the concepts that we need to discuss as we move forward with further exercises that explore this basic level of balanced whole body unified force.